Welcome to my creative session on how to use my atmosphere assets for Affinity Photo. The assets come in several categories: clouds, skies, light, and fog and mist. And I'll be showing you examples of how to use each category, more often than not, together in the same composition. There were so many interesting examples that I had to narrow them down slightly. I hope you enjoy this session and have fun using the assets to enhance your own images. First of all, let's cover installation. Now, if you have downloaded and installed the assets through the account registration and linking feature, you will automatically find them on the Assets panel, ready to use. You can show the Assets panel by going to View, Studio, and Assets. However, if you've downloaded the assets manually, you will need to import the AF asset files. Now, you can do this either by clicking on the menu icon here, choosing Import Assets, and navigating to where you have extracted the asset files, or, alternatively, you can just drag-drop the AF assets files in over the interface like so. Let's start with a fantastical composition and see how we can use these assets. So before we do anything else, I'll just move across to the Layers panel and also increase my layer thumbnail size. Now here we can make use of the clouds assets. These are individual clouds that I've extracted from high-quality photographs, and you can place them either into realistic landscape scenes or into compositions like this. By the way, on the Assets panel menu, you can also toggle a list view. And of course, this is helpful for identifying assets that you might want to reuse. So to place an asset into our document, all we need to do is click drag on the asset and bring it over to our document view here. So I've got this first cloud, and I'm going to just offer it roughly here, then let go of the mouse button, and as you can see, it gets placed as a layer in my document. Now, most assets in this atmosphere pack will have clipped filters, adjustments, or masks. These are designed to help speed up the tonal blending process if it's required, or alternatively, just give you ideas and different options for integrating these assets into your document. For example, for this particular cloud here, I might enable the long exposure motion blur filter. Now let's grab a different cloud. So I've split these into categories just to break them up slightly, rather than having one overwhelming list that you have to scroll through. So down here, I can find the next cloud I want to add and just drag it on roughly here. Then I might grab a third cloud and drag it roughly over this area of the image. And I think for this cloud, just because it doesn't stand out very well, I will enable the structure clarity filter here. Then I'll add a final cloud over here. So let's get cloud 24 and drop it in like so. Now don't forget that you can also transform these layers non-destructively, and this opens up more creative possibilities. So I could just right click on this, go to transform, and flip horizontal. Great. So those are our clouds added to the scene. Now let's go over to the light category, and I'll just collapse the light rays for a second and instead look at the lens flares. So I might get lens flare direct 2 and just drag it over this area of the image. Then I'm going to scale this up, I think, and I'm going to hold Command on Mac, Control on Windows to resize or scale around the center point, like so. Then I think I'll get lens flare direct 11 and just drag it over here, like so. Okay, so this is now slightly overkill, but with minimum effort, we have been able to use two types of assets already to transform this scene. So let me just show you the before and the after. Okay, now let's move on and look at some replacement skies in the skies category. So here I have a moody landscape image that I took years ago, and it's got this nasty blown out sky here. So I think it's due a sky replacement. Now, I have done some non-destructive dodging and burning, along with using an adjustment layer. So we have some tonal work going on here already. But before we do anything else, I need to cut out the foreground. So the quickest way to achieve this is to use W twice on the keyboard. That quickly selects the selection brush tool here. Increase my brush width and just quickly block in a selection of the foreground. A little technique I like to use is to toggle quick masking using Q on the keyboard. And this marks the background with an overlay, meaning we can very quickly identify what is currently in our selection and what is not. Then I'll toggle out of quick mask mode and then go to Refine on the context toolbar. Then I just need to increase my brush width and drag over these difficult areas, then release my mouse button to matte them. And moving on, I'll just go over this tree line here to matte these areas and some detail over here. Okay, now to maximize our cutout quality, on this dialog here, we want to set our output to New Layer or New Layer with Mask. This is because either of these two options will perform color decontamination. Basically, that is where the background color contribution around the anti-aliased or matted edge detail here gets disregarded. So it means that you can avoid that haloing effect when doing cutout work. Affinity Photo actually needs to modify the pixel data in order to perform color decontamination. And that's why it only applies with these two options. Because with mask or selection, of course, it can't modify the pixel data. These are two entirely non-destructive options. So, set to new layer, click apply, and then we have our cutout foreground layer, which I will just name quickly. And now we're ready to drop in our new sky. So let's find our way over to the skies assets here, and I'll collapse some of these, and let's look in evening skies. So if we were to quickly drag a sky in now, we would be dragging it in above the foreground pixel layer. So we would just need to reorder it in the layer stack, like so. However, to avoid this to begin with, we just need to make sure we have a layer underneath the foreground layer selected. In this case, the background layer. Then we can add in our sky straight away, like so. Now, so far, you've just seen me drag assets in and place them on the document, but there's also another approach to adding assets. Let me just delete that and I'll show you. So instead, we can double-click on an asset. Now notice we've switched to the Place Image tool. So what we can now do is draw out our asset to a particular scale or size. Then release the mouse button. This is especially useful if our assets are quite high resolution and they end up being placed into a smaller document, which of course is then frustrating when you have to zoom out and scale everything down. Now, in addition to the double click and drag technique, we can also turn on snapping up here. So now, if I double click that sky again, I can snap it to the bounds of my document, like so. So then I can make sure it absolutely fits the horizontal scale of my document. Now that we've placed the asset, we automatically have the Move tool selected for us, so I can just reposition this until it's just underneath that cutout horizon line. Now, we need to do some tonal blending here, so we can make use of the layers that are already clipped into this asset. Something I provided, which is very useful for a lot of sky replacement examples, is a horizon blend. And if I just show this, you'll see exactly what I mean. This provides a nice gradient fill from the bottom of the sky to the top. While I'm here, I will also enable brightness and contrast, and I can, of course, double-click this to go into the settings and tweak them further if I need to. Then I think I will enable the structure layer and perhaps just take the strength of this down slightly. So for this, I'll modify the opacity rather than double-clicking into the clarity layer. I can do this quickly using numbers on the keyboard. So for example, 4-5 in quick succession will give me 45% opacity. Now, something really useful about sky replacements in general is that we can use them to convert the aspect ratio of the document or image. So for example, if I just switch back to the Move tool using V, and then select my Evening Sky 11 layer here, you'll see I have all of this information currently hiding outside of this document's crop boundaries. So now what I can do is use C for the crop tool, check Reveal up here, then I can just increase the height of my crop, like so, and use Return. Okay, so now we have more of a square aspect ratio, perfect for a platform like Instagram, for example. And I think what I will do is go over to the light category, and I'm already on the direct lens flares, that's fine. So I will drag out lens flare direct 12 and just drop it up here to enhance that sunlight breaking through the clouds there. So we can see the before and the after. I might need to reposition this slightly, not a problem. V for the Move tool and just drag it over here. By the way, if you have snapping on and you don't actually want it enabled for this particular layer transformation, you can just hold Option on Mac, Alt on Windows to temporarily disable that snapping. To finish this off then, I might go over to my Fog and Mist category and let's just have some nice mist in the foreground here. So I will drag this on, and by default, if you drag one of the diagonal handles for image and pixel layers, it will scale them in an aspect correct manner. But I don't want this behavior, so I can just hold Shift to switch to non-aspect correct scaling and just bring this up roughly here, like so. Then I'll take the opacity down to maybe 30%. I'll just try that. And also, I'll just go in here and check white balance. And that just warms up that mist slightly. It's also a good idea to experiment with the position of layers in the layer stack. So for example, if I get this mist layer and I drag it underneath the curves adjustment, you will see that dramatically changes the way the mist layer renders in this document. So now I'm thinking maybe I need to try 20% opacity instead. Okay, so let's move on to a quick example. Now, if you're working with low light nighttime scenes, there are also a handful of skies you can take advantage of. So let's just go over to the skies category, and down here we have night skies. So let's insert a new sky into this image. Once again, I'll use W for my selection brush tool. I only needed to use W once because I previously toggled over to this tool. W cycles between the Flood Select tool and the Selection Brush tool. So although when you have a new session, it will go to the Flood Select tool first, within the same editing session, it will go back to the tool that you just had selected previously, which of course in my case is the Selection Brush tool. Okay, I'll just use my quick mask technique again to make sure I have a decent selection to start off with. Then I'll toggle back to my normal mode, go to Refine, and now I'll just use a large brush to go into all these areas and matte them. So down here, I've got quite a lot of sky detail hiding in between all the foliage here. So I just need to make sure I get that matted correctly as well. Okay. Looking good, I think. I'll just go over this area to see if I can make it slightly more accurate. There we go. Okay. So once again, remembering what I said about color decontamination, I'm going to set my output to New Layer, then click Apply. And underneath, my newly named foreground layer, I want to select the background layer, then add a night sky in. So let's try night sky 8. We'll just position this roughly here, scale it up slightly, like so, then just bring it up here. So just expanding my night sky layer here, I might enable brightness and contrast, double click the adjustment and make some small changes. I think that looks okay. Then I'll enable the structure layer, but it's far too strong across the entire sky. So what I can do is invert the mask. I can do this by using Command-I on Mac or Control-I on Windows. Then I'll use B for the paintbrush tool, hold Control-Option on Mac or Control-Alt on Windows, drag right and then up to create myself a nice soft-edged brush. And I'm already set to white. We can confirm this on the color panel here, which means I can just paint into the faint areas of the Milky Way here. Okay, now optionally, with the night sky assets, I've included a Star Trails Radial Blur Live filter as well. This is just a fun little option to experiment with. It basically just emulates the long exposure star trail effect that you typically achieve by exposure blending lots of long exposures together. Now, to finish this image off, I will disable these star trails, and I think I will clip a curves adjustment into the foreground layer here, like so. So I can just offer it to the text or the label, not the thumbnail. Then I think I will just add a couple of nodes to brighten up the foreground slightly and create a bit more contrast, like so. Okay, let's move back to looking at clouds and light rays briefly. So I have another example here, and first of all, I'm going to move to the top of the layer stack. Then let's go over to the clouds category. And I think I will choose this cloud here. I'll just drag it on, bring it somewhere up here, then just scale it down like so. So to make this blend better into the existing cloud detail, I'll expand the layer, enable brightness and contrast, double click that, take the contrast all the way down, and then just take the brightness down slightly as well. And also, I think we might need to make a minuscule white balance adjustment. So I will double click that, then take the white balance down just to a small negative value to give the cloud a cooler tone. Let's have a look at some more clouds. So I'll go in here, and I think I will grab cloud 68, and I'm about to make a little bit of a mistake here. So you'll see that we don't have a cloud preview image, and if I let go of my mouse, the cloud doesn't appear, and that's because I previously had a child layer selected that was part of the cloud 19 parent layer. And so my second cloud has actually been placed as a child layer inside this cloud. You will probably find that this catches you off guard from time to time. The simple solution is just to drag the child layer out to the parent layer stack, like so. Alternatively, to mitigate this from happening in the first place, just be mindful of what you currently have selected in the layer stack. So for example, if I have a child layer selected, I will probably want to collapse that and select a parent layer first. Then I'm free to drag my next asset in. Okay, let me scale this down, place it roughly somewhere like here, and I need to do the same procedure. So go into my brightness and contrast, lower the contrast all the way, lower the brightness slightly, and the white balance needs cooling down as well. Not by much, just by a small negative value, like so. Then I think just to round this composition off, I'll go over to my light category, collapse this go into the landscape light rays, and I'm going to drag on light rays 2. So I'll just snap this to the top left. And once again, I want to hold Shift to do non-aspect correct scaling, just so I can stretch it out across the bounds of the document, like so. And of course, if I feel that this effect is slightly too strong, I can just take the opacity down slightly, so maybe 8 for 80% opacity. Now let's try out some of the sunset skies, as these can look really dramatic, and they can transform the mood of your images. So I've got another photo from the Peak District here, and before we do anything else, I'll use W for the selection brush tool, quickly brush in the foreground here, refine that. I don't need to do any matting here, so I'll just set my output to new layer, click apply, then I have my extracted foreground. So now, moving underneath the foreground layer, I'll go across to my skies and have a look at the sunset skies. So let's try a few of these out. Let's try Sunset Sky 7. I'll drag this in, position this roughly here, then expand the layer and enable the horizon blend. I think what I might also do is enable structure. This is probably slightly too strong, so let's back off the opacity slightly, maybe to about 60%. I'm not totally sure about this, so let's hide this sky for now and try out a different one. Let's try Sunset Sky 24. So I'll just bring this in and then position it somewhere about here. Now for this, the temperature doesn't match with the foreground, so I'll enable white balance here, quickly go in here and just take that down, like so. This still isn't quite doing it for me, so I'll hide this, and then I'll try another one, maybe Sunset Sky 11. So let's just position this roughly here. Once again, I will enable the horizon blend. Then let's try some of the other adjustments. So let's try saturation, white balance, and brightness and contrast. This looks really nice. I think I want to work with this, but we need to make the foreground match. So to do this, let's select the foreground pixel layer, add a gradient map adjustment, clip it into the foreground layer. Then on the gradient map, I'm going to set the left-hand node to pure black, the right-hand node to pure white, and the middle node, I am going to color pick off one of these nice reddish tones in the sky here. Okay, so now our foreground looks like this. What I now want to do is set the blend mode to something like color burn and take the opacity down, maybe to around 40%. So this gives us that really important match here in the background detail, but it does darken the foreground a bit too much. So now we can add some brushwork to help with this. I'll add a new pixel layer using Shift-Command-N on Mac or Shift-Control-N on Windows. Then use B for the paintbrush tool. If you remember previously, we already created a nice soft brush, so we don't need to do anything else there. Then I'll set the blend mode of this pixel layer to overlay, take the opacity down to around 40%, and just paint into the foreground detail here. Okay, so we've got this nice reddish hue going on that better matches the sky, but I think we can take this slightly further. I will add another pixel layer, this time set the blend mode to reflect, and take the opacity down to a low value, something like 15. Then I'm going to zoom in and just paint into these stones on this path here. Okay, this effect is perhaps slightly too strong, so that's not a problem. Once we finish the brushwork, I'll just take the opacity down. But it just gives us that lovely reflective glow on some of the stone detail here, which you might expect to find with a really strong red sky. So let's take the opacity down to maybe around 10%. And there we go. That just adds a really lovely, subtle suggestion. Okay, so now, still within the foreground pixel layer, I will add a curves adjustment and just bring everything up slightly, but keep those tones fairly dark. So we want to keep that contrast in the scene. Like so. Okay, and here we go. Are you ready for the before and the after? So that's quite a dramatic difference. We've completely changed the feel of this image. Although, just being a perfectionist here, I'm not happy with the strength of the reflective pixel layer. It's perhaps a little bit too strong for my liking. So let's try maybe 7%, something like that. And I might even get the erase brush tool, that's E on the keyboard, and just erase away from any edges that have spilled over slightly onto the grass. Okay, that's me done now. So next up, I've got an old photo of Whitby Harbour that could use some attention. Let's see if we can add a bit more mood and atmosphere to this. So first of all, let's go across to my fog and mist category. I think I'll pick Mist 4, just drag that on like so. Then I can just use the left handle here to scale it in a non-aspect correct fashion until it reaches across the entire horizontal bounds of the document. Now currently the mist effect looks a bit too obvious and perhaps fake, so let's take the opacity down maybe to around 45%. But now it's not quite visible enough, so clipped into the mist layers, you'll find a couple of levels adjustments for increasing or decreasing density. Let's try the increased density layer. There we go, that looks quite nice. So let's move on and add some fog over the entire image. So let's go to the fog subcategory and drag in fog 10 like so. Once again, I've snapped it to the top left of my document, but now I just need to hold Shift to be able to scale it over the rest of the document. Then I can take the opacity down, maybe to around 35%. Now, within the light category, I've provided these lens flares, and they are quite stylized, but we can also be creative with them and use them in a really subtle way. So for example, if I drag on the direct lens flare, number 1, this of course looks a bit ridiculous in context of this image at the moment. But let me scale it down slightly, and I'm going to stretch it out like so, hold Command on Mac, Control on Windows, again to resize around the center point instead. And let's say I want this flare or glare coming off the water here. What I can do is go over to the Effects panel, enable Gaussian blur and bring that up until the fine detail of the lens flare starts to disappear and instead just becomes more of a very subtle suggestion. So rather than being able to see this blue outline here, it just kind of blends into the composition instead. And of course, back on the Layers panel, if the effect is slightly too overpowering, let's just try taking the opacity down slightly. Now I feel this is perhaps too weak, so let's try 90% as a good midpoint. I'm also just going to scale the lens flare in slightly so it doesn't spill over too much into the tops of the houses here. Now I think I might add some more fog. So let's add fog 1, just bring it over the entire image here. Once again, hold Shift to scale it like so. Then upon expanding this, we've got 2 masks we can use here. So fade upwards will just take away the very top of the fog. And again, I think I'll try a lower opacity, maybe 30%. Now on top of all these layers, I'm going to add a curves adjustment in an attempt just to bring some more contrast and depth back to this scene. So now, with all of these layers, let's just see the before and the after. Okay, looking nice. We might find it is slightly too stylized, but again, that's not a problem because we can just go in non-destructively and perhaps just experiment with the opacity of these various layers like so. Now, next, I've also had an old composition that I worked on a while ago. It felt too dark and flat, so let's see if we can give it a bit of a lift. First of all then, I will place some fog into this scene. So I'm just going to scale it across the foreground here, perhaps just bring it up, and like I did with the previous image, just enable the fade upwards mask here, and just rescale this until I'm happy with how it looks. Then I'll take the opacity down, maybe to around 50%. So I'm going to add a lens flare into this image, I think, but before we do that, I need to add a white balance adjustment because I want to warm the image up slightly. The majority of the lens flares have quite a warm tone, so we want our composition to match that. Then I'll go to my light category here, have a look at the directional lens flares, and I think I'll try lens flare directional 4, just bring that in like so, position it in the top right here, and then just scale it out slightly. Again, don't forget you can use Shift for non-aspect correct scaling. And I think I'll go for something like this. Then once we've added in that lens flare, we could use another white balance adjustment on top of it, just to cool the image down slightly. And I could also add a final curves adjustment, just to add even more mood and contrast to the scene. So again, just a very quick addition of some of these assets can completely transform the feel of this composition. For my final example then, on a trip to New York, I took a long exposure photograph of the Kennedy Reservoir. There wasn't really enough cloud detail though to make a truly compelling image, so let's see if we can enhance the sky slightly. I'll go over to my clouds category, then I'll just go into my second subcategory here, and I'm going to drag out cloud 29. Okay, just roughly position that here. Then in my child layers, I can enable long exposure. But also this cloud is too bright. Now you might immediately go for the brightness and contrast adjustment, but don't forget there's also an exposure adjustment here. And sometimes doing a linear exposure adjustment can help it blend more successfully than a brightness and contrast adjustment. So now I'll pick another cloud. Let's go for cloud 78. Let's just bring it in over here, like so. Go in here and once again, enable long exposure and enable the exposure adjustment. Now this cloud is perhaps slightly too bright, so let's go in and lower the exposure ever so slightly. Then let's add a third cloud. So again, notice that after making some adjustments to the child layers, I deliberately select the parent layer again, just so I don't fall into that trap that I showed you earlier of accidentally dragging an asset out as a child layer. So let's go and find cloud 43. Okay, so I want to flip this cloud, and again, I could right-click, go to transform, then flip horizontal. That's certainly an option. But also, here's another interesting technique. So we're going to use the double-click and place functionality. Now, if we start to drag out from, say, the top left, we'll drag it out with its original orientation. However, if we drag out from the top right instead, the asset is automatically horizontally flipped. So once again, I'll go into my child layers, Enable long exposure. Take the exposure down. I perhaps just need to double click this, go in and modify it further. There we go. And also, this cloud is perhaps slightly too warm, as is this one, now that I look at it. So let's enable white balance, double click, go in here and just make some microscopic white balance adjustments, like so. And I'll also do the same for the other cloud here. Enable white balance, go in, take it down ever so slightly. Okay, then we can just have some fun with positioning these clouds in our image or composition. So let's try this one down here, perhaps this one over here, or I might bring this one back up here again. And of course, I could add some more clouds in if I were so inclined. Now, since it's an overhead sun, let's add in some light rays. I'll go into my landscape light rays here, and let's have a look at the bottom one, light rays 12. Just drag this in like so, stretch it across my document, and then I can just take the opacity down slightly, maybe 90% will do, or perhaps 80. And there we go, we've just added a little bit more visual interest to this photograph. And I think I've just spotted something here. I believe I just need to select my light ray, there we go, and just snap it right up to the top here. Okay, and we're good to go. And that concludes my creative session on using the atmosphere assets. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope my examples have given you some ideas of how to use them. I wish you all the best, and take care.